History often remembers the moment freedom is declared, but it rarely pauses long enough to remember the price that made that moment possible. In 1776, the colonies announced their break from the British Empire through the United States Declaration of Independence. To many, it was a triumph of liberty, a bold stand for self-government. But the war that followed was long and brutal. Farmers became soldiers, cities burned, families were divided between loyalty and rebellion, and thousands of people who never held political power still carried the heaviest burden of the conflict. Even freedom itself was complicated. While the new nations spoke of liberty, millions of enslaved Africans remained in bondage, and native nations across the continent would soon face expansion that threatened their lands and survival. Nearly 2 centuries later, another global moment of victory arrived. In 1945, the world celebrated the end of the World War II. The defeat of regimes like Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler was seen as a triumph for freedom and democracy. But the cost was staggering. More than 70 million people were dead. Entire cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. And in places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world witnessed the terrifying new reality of nuclear war. Victory was real, but so were the scars. History shows a pattern that is both powerful and uncomfortable. Nations speak of freedom in moments of crises. Leaders promise security, survival, and a better future. Yet behind every declaration, every war, and every victory parade, there are ordinary people whose lives are forever changed by decisions made far above them. And that is why historians often ask a quieter question. When nations fight for freedom, who truly pays the price? In 1776, the American Declaration of Independence promised liberty, equality, and self-determination. It was a bold statement that would inspire generations. The idea that people could govern themselves and live free from oppression. But freedom is never simple, and history rarely tells the full story. Long before European settlers arrived, Native American nations had lived on these lands for thousands of years. Their cultures were rich, complex, and deeply connected to the land. Yet the new United States saw these nations not as neighbors, but as obstacles to expansion. Policies of displacement began almost immediately. Treaties were often broken, lands were seized, and tribes were pushed further westward. Entire ways of life were threatened, hunting grounds lost, sacred sites destroyed, communities uprooted. One of the darkest chapters came decades later with the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands. They walked hundreds of miles through harsh terrain, facing disease, starvation, and exposure. Thousands did not survive the journey. Families were shattered, communities were decimated. The irony is stark. While the colonies celebrated their independence and the birth of a new nation, countless people already living on that land endured suffering and death. Freedom for one person came at a devastating cost for another. History remembers the victory of a nation, but the human cost of that victory, the lives lost, the cultures uprooted, the land taken, is a story too often left untold. This is the truth behind the first freedom. A nation born in liberty, but built on the displacement of those who had called the land home for centuries. Throughout history, wars have always worn noble words as their armor: freedom, security, defense. These are the phrases leaders use to rally nations, to inspire soldiers, to justify unimaginable destruction. But behind the banners and speeches lies a pattern that repeats itself, one that rarely gets the attention it deserves: the human cost. In 1914, the world plunged into what would be called World War I, the Great War. Millions of soldiers marched across Europe's fields, believing they were protecting their nations, their families, and their way of life. Trenches stretched for miles, muddy, waterlogged, and infested with disease. Life and death became interchangeable. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, over 16 million people were dead, with tens of millions more wounded, physically and emotionally scarred. Families were left broken, economies shattered. A generation forever marked by loss. Barely 2 decades later, the world faced an even darker nightmare. World War II erupted, fueled by aggressive ideologies and unresolved tensions. Cities across Europe, Asia, and beyond were bombed into rubble. Entire populations were forced from their homes. Hunger, fear, and death became daily companions for millions of civilians, while soldiers endured unimaginable horrors on the front lines. By 1945, over 70 million lives had been lost, more than the entire population of some nations. Victory was claimed, yet the world bore wounds that would last generations. The pattern is clear. Nations speak of noble causes, and people answer the call. Yet the cost is almost always paid by ordinary humans, not the leaders who give the orders. History teaches us that power, freedom, and security often come with a shadow, and that shadow is measured in lives lost, families shattered, and cultures scarred, a lesson that echoes into today's conflicts, quietly asking, at what cost do we claim victory? History has a way of repeating itself, not perfectly, but in patterns we ignore at our peril. Today, the world watches anxiously as tensions flare between the United States and Iran. Military movements, political posturing, and regional disputes dominate the headlines. The rhetoric is familiar: freedom, security, defense, echoing the noble words that preceded past conflicts. Yet if we look deeper, the warning signs mirror history almost exactly. Over a century ago, before World War I, Europe was a powder keg. Alliances crisscrossed the continent. Regional conflicts simmered. Political pressure built quietly but relentlessly. No one truly believed a global war was possible, until it erupted suddenly, with devastating effect. Today, analysts warn that the same dynamics are emerging. Strategic alliances are being tested. Regional tensions are escalating. Economic sanctions, military exercises, and public threats create a slow-burning pressure that can ignite unexpectedly. The world watches, often in disbelief, assuming large-scale war is impossible, until it is not. History does not simply repeat, it rhymes. Patterns emerge in cycles of tension, diplomacy, and miscalculation. The lessons are there for anyone willing to study them. Wars rarely start overnight. They creep forward, tension by tension, moment by moment. The danger is that ordinary people often bear the cost long before leaders understand the consequences. Families, communities, and entire nations are affected when power, pride, and politics collide. The story is clear: vigilance matters. Awareness matters. Understanding history matters. Because the choices made today, the decisions to escalate or de-escalate, will shape the lives of millions, just as the mistakes of the past shaped the course of centuries. And once again, the world faces the quiet question history keeps asking: how much must be paid for freedom, and who will pay the price? When nations move toward conflict, the language used by leaders often sounds calculated and distant. They speak of strategy, security, deterrence, and victory. Maps are studied, alliances are debated. Military plans are drawn with precision, but the real story of war is rarely written on those maps. It is written in the lives of ordinary people. History shows this pattern again and again. When the United States expanded across North America during the 19th century, the consequences were devastating for many indigenous nations. Policies like the Trail of Tears forced thousands from their ancestral lands. Families walked hundreds of miles through harsh conditions, and many never survived the journey. These were not generals or politicians making decisions in distant capitals. They were mothers, fathers, elders, and children caught in the path of national ambition. The same human cost appeared on a global scale during the great wars of the 20th century. In the trenches of World War I, millions of soldiers endured mud, hunger, and relentless artillery fire. Many were young men who believed they were defending their homeland, yet they would never return to the families who waited for them. Only a generation later, the devastation grew even larger during World War II. Cities across Europe and Asia were reduced to rubble. Civilians fled advancing armies. Entire communities disappeared under bombing campaigns and occupation. Victory was eventually declared, but the losses were measured not just in territory or political outcomes. They were measured in empty homes, broken families, and memories that survivors carried for the rest of their lives. This is the uncomfortable truth that history quietly reveals. When nations clash, power decides the course of events. But the price is most often paid by those who hold the least power to change it. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, caught in extraordinary moments of history. History rarely repeats itself in exactly the same way, but it often echoes through time, repeating familiar patterns that thoughtful observers cannot ignore. Every generation tends to believe it has learned from the past. New technologies emerge, diplomacy evolves, and societies become more connected than ever before. Yet the deeper forces that shape conflict, fear, pride, competition for power remain strikingly similar. Before the outbreak of World War I in 1914, many people believed a large global war was impossible. Europe was economically connected, its nations tied together by trade, diplomacy, and royal family alliances. Yet beneath the surface, tensions were quietly building. Rival alliances, growing nationalism, and deep mistrust between powerful states. A generation later, those same patterns contributed to the rise of World War II. Economic crises, wounded national pride, and political extremism created conditions that pushed the world toward another catastrophic conflict. By the time the war ended in 1945, tens of millions of lives had been lost, and entire regions of the world had been devastated. These events reveal an uncomfortable truth. Warning signs often appear long before the explosions of war. Rising tensions, competitive nationalism, fear and suspicion between powerful nations. Each sign alone may seem manageable, even ordinary, but together, they can slowly push the world toward a breaking point. History offers these lessons not as predictions, but as warnings. It reminds us that choices made by leaders and supported or questioned by societies can determine whether tensions escalate into tragedy or are resolved through restraint and understanding. The question, then, is not whether history matters. Its lessons are written across centuries of human experience. The real question is whether humanity is willing to listen. Because every time nations claim they are fighting for freedom, history quietly asks the same haunting question. Freedom for whom? And who will ultimately pay the price?